I do want to say to all of our friends, we want to pray for you to have a joyful festival of lights, that you would be the light in the world. Yeshua, as Sarah said, Yeshua said, John 16, verse 33, in the world you're going to have tribulations and problems, but be encouraged because I have overcome the world. And she also quoted from Isaiah that we are to arise and shine, that in the world around us is going to be great darkness, but the glory of the Lord will shine upon us. So that's really the deeper meaning of this holiday, that Yeshua gives us through his Spirit joy and light, and you can shine in the midst of all the difficult circumstances around you. Well, I do want to take a little time today and explain about the historical background of this holiday, a little bit of the halachic, rabbinic laws connected with it, and some messianic meaning. That's a lot to do. I'm going to try to do it real short for you. Well, let's start with this. This here is what we call in Hebrew a Hanukkah. It's not a menorah, which would be the lampstand in the temple. The lampstand in the temple has 7 branches to it. This has 9. The 9 in the Hanukkah for the holiday of Hanukkah is for 8 days of the rededication of the temple, and 1 is for what is called the shamash, which lights the others. Now, this is not in the Bible, but in rabbinic tradition, the idea is that these 8 lights are holy, and the one that you use to light it is not holy. So you can use this unholy, as it were, candle to light the others. The others, because they're holy, can only be used for one thing, which is to declare the miracle, to declare the miracle of Hanukkah. And that's why you put the Hanukkah in the window for people to be able to see it. Now, all that, I'll get into the history of this in just a moment, but that's the meaning of it. In the scriptures, of course, we have a 7-branched menorah, lampstand, which is in the tabernacle and the temple, and that's what was dedicated at the time of Hanukkah. Did you get that? So in Hanukkah, you have 8 lights here, plus a 9th shamash, which are for the 8 days of the holiday, in which they rededicated the temple and also rededicated the 7-branched menorah. So what's in the temple is a menorah, and this is a Hanukkah. I hope that was simple enough. It's going to get more confusing in just a moment. Not more confusing, a little more complicated. Let's go back. I want to give you a little historic background. If you remember, the history line that comes in the Law and the Prophets ends with the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther in the 5th century BC. And the writings, the story seems to end around 400. So we imagine that at the beginning of the 4th century BC, there was the final writings of the manuscripts of the Law and the Prophets. The last one probably was the book of Chronicles, even getting toward the mid-4th century in the late 300s. That's what I can tell from the script anyway. So let's say about maybe 360, 350 BC, you have the final compilation of the Hebraic text of what's known today as we call it the Tanakh, the Law and the Prophets, what some call the Old Testament. Well, at that point, you've got these Hebrew text in just different leather and cloth garment scrolls. Now, right after that, if you remember your history, in 333 BC, then came Alexander the Great. This was the Greek Empire, and it was prophesied by Daniel and everything. The Greek Empire came from the north and from the west and conquered the whole Middle East. At that time, the whole area of Israel and Palestine, the whole Middle Eastern area, was taken over by the Greek army, the Greek government, and the Greek culture, and interesting enough, even the Greek language. Now, I believe this was the hand of God because it was to prepare the world for the language which would be better to spread the message of the Bible internationally. The Hebraic texts have to deal with the history of our own people, but the Greek background of having systemized philosophy, they prepare, and a systemized language. The Greek language was grammatically structured in an easier way to publicize it internationally. So what happened at that point was there really didn't seem to be any unified authorized text of the law and the prophets. So after the Greek culture and the Greek language came into the Middle East, even the rabbis of the Middle East here in Israel, they became bilingual. They learned Greek also. And so they translated the text of the Bible. It was called 70 of them, called the Septuagint, or as we call this in Hebrew, the translation of the 70. And they translated, and you had the first authorized full text of the law and the prophets actually was in Greek, which was the Septuagint. And that was the text that was used mostly by the apostles when the New Covenant was written, was quoting the Old Testament from this Greek text. Well, anyway, that was late 3rd century, maybe 220, something like that, before the Common Era. Well, the Greek government was there, and I believe this was the hand of God. You had the two cultures together. You had the Hebraic culture, the history of the covenants, and then you have this Greek international culture and language that came together. And this brought us up into the 2nd century BC. I'm giving you a lot of history. If you have to go back and listen to this again, you can get it. But at this point, when you come into the 2nd century BC, cross that line 200, the Greek government there becomes corrupt. And a very corrupt Greek king named Antiochus takes over 198. He takes over the government around the Middle East and Israel, and is very corrupt, pagan, and he defiles the temple and so on. And then you come into the main story of the history of the Maccabees and Hanukkah that is better known. But anyway, about 20 years after that Antiochus took over in 198, in the years 168, 167, then came a priestly family, the Hashmonaim, and was later known as the Maccabees because of their leader, Judah HaMaccabee, and they brought a rebellion against this corrupt Greek government, who had also not only been a corrupt government, but had defiled the temple. So they led this rebellion that came in, and they reconquered Jerusalem, reconquered the Temple Mount, and they cleaned out the temple from all the pagan practices. Now, this is amazing. I was thinking about that Judah Maccabee came in and they cleared out the temple from the Greek pagan practices. When Yeshua came along later, another 200 some years later after that, he came in and cleared out the temple from the hypocritical religious practices within his own people, within our people. So it was kind of a parallel there. Well, anyway, they came in, they overthrew the government, cleaned up the temple, reconquered Jerusalem, and when they did that, they went to rededicate the temple. And at the rededication of the temple, they also had to light the menorah, the 7-branched candelabra menorah in the temple. But the temple dedication, previously, remembering Solomon did the first temple at the time of the holiday of Sukkot, which is 8 days. So the biblical idea of temple dedication is 8 days. I hope you're following me. So they went to dedicate the temple in 8 days. Now, it was not at the time of Sukkot. It was at the time in the holiday in the month of Kislev, in the winter, which is this time, the 25th of Kislev. And they went to rededicate the temple, and they had the 8 days to light the menorah, the candelabra, in the temple. Whew. Now, from this, all this is pretty much established by history, well, in external historical facts, in the book of Maccabees, in the book of Josephus. All that story is pretty valid. Then came up a Jewish tradition. It seems to be much later. The first mention of it is maybe 400 years after that, 200 years AD about, which is the story of the oil lasting 8 days. Now, what did that mean? It didn't mean that there wasn't oil. It wasn't like there wasn't any oil in the city. They had to use specially priestly approved oil. And so there wasn't any priestly approved oil to light the candle. the candelabras. So this is what they're saying. A miracle happened. They had only enough for one day, and that oil lasted the other days. So that's a rabbinic tradition. There's not a lot of biblical or scriptural or external evidence of that. So it's probably just a traditional folklore of our people that became more and more popular even the later years, and I'll get to that. But now we're coming up. So now follow me here. So in the year 167 about, the Jews under the Maccabees overthrew the Greek government and army and the defiling of the temple, rededicated the temple, captured Jerusalem again, and set up a Jewish state for a small period of time. Interestingly enough, at this time, there was another nation in Italy, Rome, which was growing up as a power, which was a competing power against Greece. Greece was still stronger at this time, but Rome was getting stronger. And at that time, Rome actually endorsed this new Jewish state when it took over from the Greeks. I don't know if they had good intentions or not, but anyway, it was sort of in competition with the Greeks. So the Romans actually blessed or endorsed this new Jewish government. Well, that happened. They did that. Maybe that lasted for about 100 years, if there was some Roman endorsement. But after that, then the Romans came in and conquered them again, which is interesting. There's this cycle of taking power, doing something good, and then becoming corrupt. So what had happened was that this new Jewish state that had overthrown the corrupt Greek state, they had their own power, and then they began to be corrupt, both in the temple and the government, financially and everything, even sexual intrigue. And so on, this grew up, and then there was internal fighting, which made, even but if you know language from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, there was fighting there. It was right at that time that the Romans came in, and the Romans conquered Israel almost exactly 100 years after the time of the Maccabees. So there was a 100-year Jewish state who had conquered the Greeks, was endorsed by the Romans, and then the Romans came in 63 years BC with the great general Pompey, and they overthrew the whole nation, took control of the government. So what does that mean? You come in to the period of the Gospels and the New Covenant, and what do you have? You have the Jewish Hebraic-speaking people in the land, but you have along with them a Greek culture, Greek literature, along with the Hebraic, and you have a Roman government. I believe that this was actually the hand of God, that when the story of Yeshua took place, you had all three together. You had the Jewish covenantal history and language of Hebrew, you had the Greek culture and language around it, and you had the international Roman Empire and government in order. It set it up perfectly so that Yeshua could come then as the King of the Jews, be crucified, and then even have it in the three different languages, the Hebraic covenant, the Greek language, the Roman system. It was all made up perfectly. So this is the time we come in to the birth of Messiah. There's Hebrew and Greek culture in the nation, but the nation is being ruled by the Romans. Yeshua is born into this period, and of course, now I want you to think of something else. At this point in time, because of the Maccabees, the story of the Maccabees in Hanukkah is actually the historic prelude to the birth of Yeshua. In other words, at this time, there was a huge expectation of the coming of the Messiah. What were the people intuitively expecting? They were expecting, as Judah Maccabee overthrew the Greeks, they were expecting for another figure, a military, charismatic, religious figure to come up and overthrow the Roman Empire. And there was a very widespread expectation of a new Hanukkah, of a new Maccabee, a new rebellion, the coming of the Messiah, and Yeshua was born into that atmosphere. That's why when not only when he was born, and then 30 years later when he started preaching, there was a huge messianic expectation. He didn't have to introduce the idea of the Messiah. The issue, everybody was expecting a Messiah. Everybody was expecting a Christ King, a Messiah figure, a Son of God. The question was, who would it be, and what would he do, and what would he be like? So, and that's the background to the whole story. Now, so let's come up a little bit. As we come up through history, so you've got these two parallel, you have the different stories and narratives coming into this holiday. Well, this holiday actually was somewhat quiet. It wasn't the most publicized holiday, even among Jewish tradition. In fact, you don't find it mentioned that much in Jewish tradition. As a matter of fact, the first place in Jewish literature, Hebraic literature, where you see the holiday of Hanukkah mentioned is where? That's right, in the Gospels. The Gospels have the first written mention of the holiday, the Feast of Dedication, which is mentioned in John 10. It's interesting to note there that there isn't much discussion about the holiday. It's not really pushing it, it's not criticizing it, it's just there, which kind of fits what seems to have happened in first century Judaism, that the holiday was there, but it wasn't a big central holiday. Now, as you come up later on, particularly, I'm going to jump all the way up now, in the modern period in our lifetime, in this last 100 years or so, when the population of Jews in America grew to very large, and they were in the midst of an evangelical Christian culture, then there came up sort of this parallel celebration between Christmas and Hanukkah. Of course, in the original, you don't really know if there is any connection with that. There's not really any mention of a Christmas celebration or that much of a Hanukkah, but in modern, at least American Christian evangelical culture and Jewish exilic culture, the two became parallel. And therefore, the importance of the miracle of the light and the oil of Hanukkah became very important, because it had to be something matching the miracle of the Christmas story. So it had these two miracle stories going on. Let me just mention that the Hanukkah, Feast of Hanukkah starts on the 25th day of Kislev, as the Christian traditional celebration, at least in the Western world, of Christmas starts on the 25th day of December. Now, since the Jewish calendar is on a monthly cycle, and it's not always at the same time, this year it's very early, so we're celebrating it now almost a month ahead of what the Christmas time. Sometimes they overlap. In any case, you have the 25th day of Kislev starts the Feast of Lights of Hanukkah, and the 25th day of December starts the Christian traditional holiday of the Feast of Lights, of Yeshua being born into the world as the light of the world. I find it interesting to note that if you walk through the first words of Genesis chapter 1, when you come to the 25th word in the book of Genesis, in Hebrew, it's the word light. Anyway, I don't know if that means anything, but I thought it was cute. But so you come in, and now let's jump all the way up into the modern period of time now. The celebration, what does this mean? This Feast of Lights, this Feast of Dedication. Well, everybody is kind of trying to take ownership of it. When Israel became a nation, the holiday of Hanukkah became very popular, actually among the secular Israeli Zionists, because it had this image of strong, like the Israeli pioneers and the new army and sports teams. Israeli sports teams are called Maccabees. We have a parallel Olympic Games called the Maccabee Games. And so there was this image. It became an image of secular Israeli, if I can say it this way, non-religious. It was almost an anti-Jewish traditional holiday. It became a big holiday of the Israeli secular Jews, represented as sports and military and strength. But then as the Orthodox community in Israel has grown more and more, it's taken on just the opposite meaning of saying the Jewish culture is coming against the Greek culture. And it was interpreting Israeli secular culture as being Greek and European, and the holiday of Hanukkah is Judaic tradition against the Greek secular. And so who really owns this holiday? So you've got the competition with Christian Christmas on one side, the Israeli adopting this as its pioneer, strong Israeli image, and then you have the religious Jews saying, no, this should be a Jewish rabbinic rejection of secular culture. Which one is it? You can try to figure that out, but it's actually a combination of all those. Actually, I feel of it now that there's kind of been a reconciliation of it recently, in that the conflict, which was a little more apparent, maybe even just 10 years ago, it's kind of a holiday now that everybody is celebrating together, both the secular Jews and the secular Israeli and the more religious Jews celebrating together as a national holiday. And then for us as the Messianic community saying that, well, the real meaning of this is the light of Yeshua coming into the world. So you've got the Israeli meaning, the Jewish meaning, the Messianic meaning, it all comes together. Woohoo! It's very kind of exciting with it. Now, let's take a moment and just to remember, let's go back for where we base our faith on is, of course, is biblical spiritual meaning. So let me just take one last, if you can follow with me, with one more stream, which is the biblical stream of thought here. Now, remember, when God designed the tabernacle, one of the items in the tabernacle was a golden lampstand, a golden menorah. It was set with 7 branches. It was filled with oil, and then that was lit. And part of the job of the priest in the tabernacle, and then later in the temple, was to keep this lampstand, this menorah, lit. And so it has a spiritual meaning. This was also, you find that in the Torah. Now, when you come up to the historical books, then Solomon took the lampstand and he took it from the Mosaic tabernacle and he put it into the Solomon temple. And it seems to, as I can understand it, he actually made 10 of them. He put 10 menorahs in it, as Solomon liked everything really big. But so it was taking that symbol and multiplying it into the bigger Solomon's empire that spread from Israel internationally. But you don't have that much of an interpretation of what is the meaning of this. Of course, it's intuitively obvious to people that you have light and oil and fire, so it's something good, and it's gold lampstand, but there isn't that much of an explanation to it. You come up another 500 years after Solomon to the time of Zechariah, and he has a vision. He has a vision of this 7-branch lampstand, and he has a prophecy about it, in which he says the famous "Lo b'chayav, lo b'koach, ki im beruchi, amar Adonai," when he says, not by power and not by might, by my spirit. And he describes a lampstand together with 2 olive branches or olive trees combining together with it. And so what he's saying is both the lampstand and the olive tree, from which the oil comes from the olive tree into the lampstand, to fill the lampstand, to light it with fire and light. This has symbolic, prophetic, spiritual meaning. But he still didn't say exactly what it was. When we finally come up to the new covenant, then Yeshua as the Messiah says, I am the light of God who've come to light up the world. And he said, if you receive me by faith, you will receive the Spirit of God, and then you will become the light of the world. So that becomes, Yeshua solves gives the prophetic meaning of this lampstand and of this Hanukkah by inference as well. The last reference is, of course, when you come up to the book of Revelation, you have the final revelation about the lampstand. And in Revelation chapter 1, you have an appearance, an apocalypse of Yeshua, and he's standing in the midst of 7 lampstands, and it says very clearly, the lampstands represent the ecclesia, the kehillah, the church, the people of God, which is the people within Israel and the nations who have received true faith, repentance, love, joy, the Spirit of God, and the light of God through the Messiah. The light comes from God. Yeshua is the shamash that lights us up, and then we are to become the light of the world in his name. And that is the meaning, the real spiritual meaning of this holiday. So because it has to do with oil, in our way as Jews and Israelis, we make tradition out of that. So in our country, you have to eat a lot of oily cooked donuts and eat, of course, oily cooked latkes or levivot here. But that's not the real meaning of it, of course, is that the oil is the anointing of the Holy Spirit. And we are to become God's Hanukkah. We are to become God's menorah. Well, that's enough, I think, information for you today on that. I will just say that it takes a lot of thought and prayer about this, because do we believe in going up on the temple? Should we go up and overthrow the mosques and the temple? Is that what you mean by that? Or do you mean that we should eat donuts? Or should we just light Hanukkah? Should we mean it that we are the light of Yeshua in the world? We need to really pray to have pure hearts and analyze. I've went all this over because this is a complicated story. Not of being the lights of the world, that's easy. Yeshua is the light of the world. He lights us up. We become his lampstand in the world. That's what we need to concentrate on. But the cultural, the historic, the political implications of this holiday can be pretty complicated. So let's pray for it. I remember we have a dear friend, a Messianic believer, who was actually among some of the frontline soldiers who recaptured the Temple Mount in 1967. And he told us that they had a bomb with them. He was in the engineering squad. And he said they had a bomb there to blow up the mosques on the Temple Mount. And they waited all night and prayed. Well, they didn't pray, but they waited all night. And finally, the government decided not to do it. But so these are interesting issues. What kind of Messiah are we expecting? Military, light, spiritual. But we believe in the spiritual aspects of it, and that's what we're here to celebrate. Again, Yeshua is the light of the world. He lights us up, and then we together become the light of the world. And I want to tell you today, no matter what you're dealing with in your life, problems, difficult, depressing things, frustrating things, I just want you to be encouraged and be lit up by the light of the world. So we're going to go over now. Ofer and I are going to go over with our team here, and we'll light the Hanukkah with you. And you get yours ready. We're going to light the fifth candle with you in just a moment.